You've got all these different panels. There's more doors in here, and there's these spring attached drive sleds. We covered all that already. So obviously that thing's expensive to make. This is attempting to take bits and pieces of it though and bring it down. We're pretty excited about it just because again the 215 wasn't our best overall, so we like that case. Now for this thing, other than the front two fans being just larger, a couple other interesting points about them. First of all, there's no dust filter on this, it's just an ultrafine mesh, and that's the better way to go. It blocks almost all of the dust, and it's a lot better for airflow. You don't have to worry about the mesh filter lining up with a dust filter in a way that it just blocks itself. So this is pretty straightforward. It's going to be good for airflow, and the panel itself isn't really going to be obstructing much. Now with the way these are molded and designed, it is pretty interesting because they've done it so that it basically fits up against the panel and provides this flow guide inside of the fan. You can see that circle around the inner diameter of it, similar to a lot of GPU fans, where Lian Li is able to block any meaningful air leakage out the sides of the fan as it's mounted to the case. So that's an upside. Now downside is it's custom. You're not really going to be able to find radiators for the most part that fit these. You'd probably have to replace it with something else, and that just kind of sucks because then the fans are a large part of the case. But we think this is Lian Li's way of trying to do the larger fan thing that's becoming popular without increasing the width of the case too much and without totally retooling, because again, the outsides of this case, just like the 215 next to me, they come in enough that it does make a lot of the 200 mil pointless because you're just blowing air into a metal wall, and so you're sacrificing all the pressure that you sacrifice on a 200, and you're not gaining all of the area to push the air through. So this is a good balancing point, and we expect it's going to do extremely well in our thermal benchmarks today. So for the front fans, they're mounted on rails, and we've got them plugged in right now, so I can't completely pull this out to the side, but if you come in around this angle, you'll see that the two rails here can be repositioned. So you can space these out for 120, 140, or obviously these 160 mil fans. Interestingly, these are 160 mil on this side, so the inner diameter of the fan, so the blades and the actual fan, that's 160. The outside's 170 because of that unique shape they have. So you're not going to be able to use those in really anything else, but it's interesting that Lian Li has committed to all of this plastic molding and special tooling for a $100 case. So we think those are probably going to show up more in other cases in the future. But you could swap them out for smaller fans and radiators if you wanted. It's not as good as a complete enclosed radiator tray like you see in a lot of other cases, but at least gives you some options. So just as a counter example, the radiator tray on the LanQuil 3 is way more advanced. It can be fully enclosed. You can do fans inside or outside of it, depending on how much coverage you want across the mesh for better intake, better lower impedance versus just closer to the front. And then it's also spring loaded, so you can easily get it in and out of there, and just generally a higher quality radiator tray than what you see on the LanQuil 216. But the 216 is way cheaper, so that's kind of the type of trade-off you get with these. Now as for the other interesting cooling feature of things before we get into the rest of the case, so that fan I was showing earlier, that is optional. It doesn't come with that. We just threw a Noctua fan in there as exhaust. But it's something that's included with the case. It's not, you don't pay for it as an accessory, you pay for it as stock. But this thing covers all except for one slot of I/O. And so what it does, the idea is that if you have a larger GPU, like an FE or something, especially with the fin orientation horizontally, this can help ease with pulling the air out of the GPU and out of the case. Problem is a lot of GPUs aren't horizontal exhaust. They use vertical fin stacks, which is fine. It works. It depends how the rest of the card's designed, but it works fine. But in those cases, this isn't going to do a whole lot, except for pull air out from underneath the GPU, which could help accelerate some intake depending on the rest of the configuration. But this is something that would work great with horizontal fin orientation on, again, an FE type card, except it covers all the I/O. So if you need any I/O below the top slot, which is rare on GPUs, but still sometimes a thing, then this blocks it. And if you do anything with NICs, like add-in cards or sound cards, anything like that might be in these PCIe slots, you're not going to be using this thing. And that size for 120 mil. So to get that in, though, requires some motherboard movement. The case is sized so that you can put the board in either a water cooling mode or an air cooling mode. And default, it ships in what they call water cooling mode, realistically, all this means is that the motherboard moved. So moving the motherboard a few centimeters does not instantly change how the case behaves. It's pretty similar. It's just that you get some more radiator clearance at the top in the default water cooling mode, and you can attach this thing in the air cooling mode, but it moves the GPU up to the top slot in the expansion slot. So that's what that is. I'm going to pass over to Patrick, though, to actually talk about how it works and show what it looks like.
So right now I have it set up in water cooling mode. This is the way the case ships. So this is the mode with the motherboard shifted down 2 centimeters. It's a pretty conventional case layout, but it does give some extra room above the motherboard so that you can have wider radiators, like maybe a 280 millimeter CLC with a radiator and fan stacked on top of each other, and it won't clip into the motherboard. So that radiator compatibility is really the main feature of water cooling mode. In order to switch between the two modes, it's really just about moving the motherboard standoffs up or down. You do also have to rotate the rear I/O assembly because, you know, obviously if the motherboard moves up or down, all these ports move up and down. And in order to rotate this, you got to take this fan out of the back. But I promise, it's not that much of an issue. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then we can talk about air cooling mode. So you're going to want to switch modes before you actually build the system. If you want to switch modes after you've installed everything in here, it does involve taking the motherboard out. Taking the motherboard out involves disconnecting everything. So this is something you want to make your mind up about before you put all your parts in. Flip it around. Because I've shifted the standoffs up, I'm actually going to take out this top PCIe slot cover, and that has some issues of its own, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So now we have the case in air cooling mode. I know it might seem like that took a while, but I've worked on the Lian Li Odyssey X, and I promise it's nothing compared to that. But what does that actually do? We have the motherboard shifted up, so obviously that gives us a little more room down here. You could probably fit some 140s down here even with the motherboard shifted down, but this really gives you more room to work with if you wanted to mount some fans on top of the shroud. It also obviously moves the GPU up, which means that now the GPU is in the top slot here, which means that we can clip this rear fan on, and the very top row of I/O on the GPU, you know, typical GPU, typical motherboard, is going to be right above the level of this fan. So now we have the ability to put this fan on here. The most obvious drawback of switching into air cooling mode is that this top PCIe slot is unusable. Most motherboards have the primary GPU slot in the second. A standard ATX board has 7 expansion slots, and the GPU is usually in the second one from the top. If you have like an X299 Dark, for example, or if you have maybe a small form factor board where the GPU slot is in the very top slot, then you're not going to be able to use air cooling mode. Shifting the board up is going to eliminate that top slot, and you're not going to be able to use it. If you're worried about compatibility with air cooling mode, the easiest way to check is just if your primary PCIe slot, the one you want to use for your GPU, lines up with the center row of screw holes on your board, or the bottom row if it's micro ATX, that's going to get cut off in air cooling mode. If your GPU sits below that center row of screw holes, then you're good. It won't be cut off. Lian Li's done transforming cases before. They've tried it on the small form factor O11s. We liked those. They've tried it on the Odyssey X. We did not like that. And they've done it here, where we just have to ask why wasn't the case a couple centimeters taller. Either way, that does it for this section, and let's head back to Steve and finish out the build.
Back to me for the rest of the case. So the top panel on our review sample sagged down, actually, as one of the only fit and finish issues that we saw, and it was sagging by about 0.5 centimeter at its worst point at the back. You can really see it with the ruler on it. Not a big deal, but the mesh reduces the structural integrity, clearly, and this wasn't a problem on the Landcool 3 because that panel was attached with one thumb screw in the center rather than just two at the corners. Doesn't cause any harm. It is visible though, and we checked, and it's definitely not intentional. As for other external elements of the case, Lian Li includes a warning in the manual to not remove the side panel mesh without removing the glass panel first, because it rests on top of the mesh. We gave it a try. It's pretty hard to do it incorrectly. You'd have to be extremely determined to damage the case, so it kind of falls under that category of if it feels like you're going to break it, you should stop. Internally, the motherboard tray sits flush with the cable grommet bar. You saw some of this when Patrick was doing his demonstration, and it allows wider than ATX motherboards to overhang, but there aren't additional standoffs for them, obviously. The bar can be flipped to move the grommets toward the front of the case for a maximum motherboard width of 280 millimeters, although wider boards could be installed by overlapping the grommets as well. For cable management, it's good, although that's been the rule rather than the exception these days for the past couple of years now with case reviews. The hard drive cage can be shifted forward without removing any screws for extra cable management room, and one or both of the mounts can be removed entirely. Velcro straps also surround the motherboard tray, and Lian Li has also included some rigid plastic clips that are even easier to work with. Lian Li suggests using the two straps above the PSU to hold cable slack rather than stuffing all of it under the power supply shroud. That should work well, but only if that area isn't being used for SATA cables. The steel side panel isn't held in place with any screws, so tidy cable management is important for this one, but we had no problems keeping it fastened. Front I/O is the usual. On one hand, Lian Li has provided two Type A USB ports and a Type C, but on the other, it's sticking with a combined audio jack. The entire I/O module can be shifted to a second location on the side of the front panel, and on the RGB SKUs, which we don't have, the secondary location can also be used to install a control module with buttons for changing lighting patterns on the fan hubs and the rim separately, as well as two additional Type A ports. Time to get into thermals now. So this is another case where, like the Landcool 215 or the Fractal Torrent, the front's not really suited to radiators. The whole point of the case is you get these interesting statement fans at the front that are also pretty functional, especially for just simple air cooling. You can still do water cooling in these cases, clearly, but you need to take more care with it. So with these, with 200 mils, technically there's some 200 millimeter radiators on the market. They work okay, but 200 millimeter fans just don't really generally have enough static pressure to perform excellently with all that impedance of a radiator. It can work, but not always. For 180s, you can definitely get a high performer with a 180 mil radiator, but that's a really rare radiator size. We have one in our own Torrent water cooling build. In this case, your options are pretty limited because of the case fans. And so what's going to happen is if you do want to put a radiator in the front, what we need you to be aware of is that, you basically should take the fans out and replace them, which sucks because that's a lot of the cost of the case. But if you're going to go that route, then there is a blocking plate, like a seal, that's included with the 216 that you can include in this front panel to help prevent air recirculation, because you're going to have now gaps where these fans used to be. So really good attention to detail from Lian Li, because they're giving you that option where swapping the fans out, you create this big hole in the case suddenly. Air can get out and recirculate in. It's not going to perform that well. That's where the seal plate comes in. And as far as CLCs go, or closed loop coolers, AIOs, a lot of people call them, you really don't want to mount it in the bottom. So there are bottom mounts for fans. You can see them in here, and it is tempting to maybe put a radiator down there. Now a radiator in open loop, that's going to be okay as long as the pump's sort of surrounded by water otherwise. But a radiator in the bottom of the case, if the pump is above it and there's no other water above that, like a reservoir, you're basically guaranteed to kill the pump, normally within a year or so. So tubes at the top, not great for it, but not guaranteed death of the pump. Radiator at the bottom and pump above everything else, basically guaranteed death of the pump. So just don't configure it that way. And when using the bottom anyway, like in an open loop, you're going to be limited on access to the motherboard, of course. If you go with an ATX board, the height of the radiator plus the fan is going to be a problem for a lot of builds. So you'll have to size that out, check the dimensions. Micro ATX is going to be easier. And as for if you want to do a radiator like in the front or the top or something, our recommendation, go with the top mount. It is available. And if you need the extra space, you can move the motherboard. Okay, enough of all that. Let's get into the actual benchmarking now and see how this thing performs. So for most of our tests, we kept the case in its water cooling mode, as they call it, because that's the way it ships by default, and it's also more widely compatible. It's therefore fair to treat it as the performance baseline. We also ran 2 extra tests, one in air cooling mode and one in air cooling mode with an additional 120mm fan attached to the rear expansion slot bracket. We'll start off with the usual full system torture test and just some land cool cases first. The